Welcome, Jess Wade, to OpenEnded. We are really, really excited and thrilled to have you join us today. And I'll have Olivia Williamson share a little bit about OpenEnded.
Hi, so OpenEnded is a platform for activists, designers, and thinkers around the world. Together, we will be exploring the spaces where creativity, culture, and design intersect with technology, science, and engineering, with a lens on challenging existing structures and entrenched perspectives. We welcome you to join in as we bring a truly diverse community of creators together through this initiative of design thinking and change, and we can't wait to speak to Jess about all the work you've been doing.
So Jess, I met Jess, as I was actually saying a little bit earlier, now a couple of years ago, as part of a project that I was working on at Google Arts and Culture called Once Upon a Try. We were working with museums, cultural institutions, and scientific organizations around the world to tell the story of science and discovery over time. And so everybody from NASA to CERN to the Science Museum, and Roger Highfield, who is this incredible energetics force and also works at the Science Museum, I think as their head of comms and marketing, and their head of science now, I think. Jess, you can say more about his most recent role, but he put us in touch, and Jess and I actually ended up, well, I would say definitely this like amazing, inspiring, gigantic girl crush on my end, but also we ended up sharing a lot in common in terms of her interests outside of her work in science, because she is an incredibly important physicist, but also has been at the forefront of activism for women in science now for a very long time. So I'm going to read her a little bit of her official background. She is an Imperial College Research Fellow at the Department of Materials at Imperial College in London. Her research considers new materials for optoelectronic devices with a focus on chiral organic semiconductors. So she might be able to explain a little bit more about that later, but she's definitely a really important physicist working at Imperial College London. She has done tons of research. She's had really a vast array of important publications, prizes, and she has focused on photovoltaics and the development of advanced characterization techniques to better understand molecular packing. Outside of being in the lab, she's involved with several science comms outreach initiatives. She's deeply, deeply committed to the improvement of diversity in science, both online and offline. And since the beginning of 2018, and you may have heard of her already for this work, she's written the Wikipedia biographies of women and people of color scientists every single day. So Jess, you are a force, and thank you very much for joining us as part of this conversation. We're super thrilled to have you. If you don't mind my asking this question to start off, because I know you do this often, in layman's terms, can you speak a little bit about your focus as a physicist and what your work and your research is centered around right now at Imperial College?
Sure. So it's amazing to be on. Thank you for having me. This is such a cool network and platform. So I work in kind of between physics, chemistry, and materials at Imperial, so super interdisciplinary, or at least in my little science head, that's very interdisciplinary. And I look at new materials to create electronic devices. During my PhD, that kind of started off with solar cells, so materials to generate electricity from solar energy. And I was working particularly with carbon-based semiconductors. So traditional solar cells are made with what we call inorganic semiconductors, and carbon-based semiconductors we call organic semiconductors. After finishing my PhD and doing all of this really cool kind of characterization and developing new spectroscopies and really, really exciting techniques, I moved to working more on a particular area of semiconductors, which are these chiral semiconductors, as you very well introduced in the introduction. And chirality is this kind of fascinating property of materials or systems where you can have a pair of objects that exist as non-superimposable mirror images of one another. So our hands are chiral systems. You have a left hand and a right hand. They are non-superimposable mirror images. If you put them together like that, they're a mirror image. But if you try to put them together like that, they're not. So it's non-superimposable. And chirality can manifest at a whole bunch of different length scales. The one that's most fascinating for me is really at the molecular level. because what we found is that left and right-handed molecules can do different and really, really fascinating things. So I work with chemists who make these beautiful chiral molecules. I take them to the lab and turn them into really cool electronic devices and then study their properties. And what they could offer the world is kind of much more efficient displays. So mobile phone displays, television displays, they'd become much more efficient if we use these lovely chiral molecules. But we can also do things like super sensitive magnetic field detection, or put them into devices that would let us make use of electron spin as well as charge, which is a field of electronics we call spintronics. They could also let us do things like quantum computation and encrypted communications. So chiral molecular semiconductors have this huge capacity to transform technology. And that's what I'm really, really interested in. It's looking at these materials, studying and optimizing them, and then putting them into a whole bunch of new technologies that we haven't had a chance to play with yet.
That's super exciting, and I'm really interested, and I'm sure I won't understand how it will impact then quantum computing and quantum mechanics, because that's a whole new space of research, right?
Yeah, I think the kind of cool thing is it was an area of research, 20, 30 years ago, and there were physics professors who were getting lots of money to investigate all of these different things. And then it looked like it was going to be pretty impossible to do, because you'd have to have things so cold to create this kind of effect that you want to see to put into these technologies, that it was completely unfeasible for a whole bunch of different applications. So there were people working on it, there was some hype and enthusiasm, and then it kind of died down. And then now suddenly there's been this huge investment. People are back interested again, people are investigating and looking at it again. From my perspective, the really cool thing about chiral materials is they seem to have this property to be able to filter electron spins even at room temperature. So you don't have to cool anything down, which obviously gives you much more capacity to be able to research and optimize them and use them in electronic devices. So there's been this kind of resurgence of interest in developing quantum computational and spintronic techniques. And now there's more interested in finding new materials that will let us do that.
Why do you think the surge of interest has happened?
Because of money from big tech. I think, when big tech companies start coming into the game and competing with academics and having these, various, we don't need to name them, but all the tech companies that really want to do this, then suddenly academia gets a little spurt of enthusiasm and research and interest. And they've been doing that for decades, right? They've just been doing it under the radar. So I think mainly because we have so much more intensive computational demands now than we ever had before. And we have the capacity to be able to do these experiments that we couldn't do otherwise. The equipment, the facilities, the techniques we use have matured and developed so much over the past 10, 20, 30 years. The money has come in, big tech has much more money than it had before. And you have this kind of, I don't want to call them historical group of professors, because they wouldn't want to be called historical, but you have a group of really great insight there who also really want to make this happen. So I think there's just a lot of, enthusiasm around it at the moment.
So I want to actually come back a little bit to what got you into this space. And, you obviously have had it's felt like a really fast moving career in science, and you have very clearly, I think, started off knowing what you wanted to do, and you've gone down this one particular path. But you started off studying art and design for your foundation course at the Chelsea College of Art and Design, and you then moved on to do a Master's of Science in Physics. We don't need to go into, we can go in sort of in as much detail as you'd like to, but I'm really curious about what led you to make that decision to go from your arts course into science, if these were if you had two matching but different passions, or if this was something that was a big shift that happened for you intellectually at that age.
I think I always knew, I loved art when I was at high school. I have, my parents are both doctors. My father is a neurologist who's like obsessed with Renaissance art. So it was very much in our family when we were younger. And I think that I always potentially got a little bit competitive and wanted to be better than him at Renaissance art facts. So I was like, I'll just learn everything. And, but art had always been something for me that was probably about expressing all of the different things that you were learning or thinking from other ways. It had always been a very I loved that aspect of art, of kind of learning new techniques and doing different things like that, you know, like stop frame animation, what an awful thing, stop frame animation or anything like that. All of these different things that you learn in art, whether that's textiles or graphics or anything, I really liked the kind of challenge of mastering it. So it was always in this very, I just love learning new skills. I still completely love learning new things, whether it's art or an experimental technique. So I think that I was always super into it from kind of 13, 14, 15, 16. In the UK, we have a completely messed up education system in many ways, in that we specialize very early. So from the age of about 14 or 15, you've got to choose four. Well, when I was at high school, it was 4 or 5 subjects. Now it's 3 subjects that you study for when you're 17, 18. And then you choose your university course based on that. And so I chose art and kind of advanced maths and physics and chemistry, not thinking it was that weird, because I always just, you know, I just liked hanging out in the art classroom. And then when you go to university, you can do this 1 year of art for free. So I just figured I may as well go and try and do it. I ended up living with an Italian landlady in Florence and doing kind of history of art in Italian for 3 months, which was the biggest thing I'd ever done at the time as a young person, you know, moving out of home and going to live with this Italian who spoke no English, and Jess spoke no Italian. So it was amazing. But really that taught me that this was completely non-bizarre, you know, 400, 500 years ago. The artists of the Renaissance were incredibly scientifically trained. They could do metalwork, they could do woodwork, they could build the marble walls of a cathedral, and they could paint these extraordinary paint these extraordinary paintings of, you know, eminent, distinguished Italian bankers, and they could do all of that. And I kind of thought it was interesting then, and I think it's even more interesting now, that we've completely lost that narrative. We've completely lost that idea that you can be an artist and a scientist, and that actually your scientific skills will contribute to your art and your artistic skills will contribute to your science. And you know, as reading more and more about it, I came back to the UK to start this physics degree. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't remember any maths. So that was a bit of a stress. But actually, I think it's benefited me so much having that kind of artistic beginning for thinking about how I approach science.
So I'm curious about that, because, you know, we were speaking earlier about how this is very much a platform for interdisciplinary thinkers, and you obviously studied art and then you went into physics, but equally that's part of your work and your practice. Do you teach it all right now? I know you do a lot of research, because I'm curious about how you would bring that to curriculums today, particularly the ones that you're involved in, and how difficult it is to actually shift that. How do you make a science degree more interdisciplinary? How do you change the way of thinking, engaging, teaching? Is that possible? Or is it easier to do when you're coming from an arts degree, because you have that grounding? You know, you go to Italy and you look at least how it was done in the past. Have you thought about this?
Yeah, I think so. At Imperial, I work at Imperial College London, which is a very scientific university. So we only really have natural sciences, a department for engineering, an extraordinary department for medicine, and a business school. I shouldn't say we only really have, because that's quite a phenomenal bunch of things to have, but we don't have the arts, right? We're really lacking in music or psychology or drama or anything like that. So you're in this super intense science-focused place. We do have options that undergraduates can take, so they can study modern foreign languages and they can do things like the history and philosophy of science. But actually there's a beautiful course that the mathematics and the physics department run, which is joint with the Royal College of Music, that's just next door, and it's physics with music or mathematics with music.
Wow.
That so many of these, you know, there's some statistic, and I'll get it wrong, but where scientists who play a musical instrument are more likely than scientists who don't play a musical instrument to win a Nobel Prize. You know, the Nobel laureates are incredibly creatively minded as well. And we have these extraordinary students at Imperial on the undergraduate courses who are all playing in things like the orchestra or going off in their lunchtimes to go and play, you know, small concerts in the Royal Albert Hall. So there is certainly that creativity rippling through everyone, whether you declare it, whether you make it something that's very much about who you are, is obviously different person by person, because some people want to be seen as, you know, the super mathematical, super computational, whatever. They don't want everyone to know they're extraordinary at violin at the same time. So whether that's something that people do, but we certainly have that creativity there. I think the way that you introduce it to students is giving them that flexibility to decide how they make the course their own, you know, which options they take, do they select this or that, and then give them the opportunity to apply the science and the technical knowledge that they've learned to some kind of creative endeavor, whether that's setting up their own startup, which, you know, all of the undergraduates and postgraduates want to do at the moment, whether that's doing something joint with the Royal College of Art that's literally, you know, a couple of maybe 100 meters away from the physics department. Potentially that's doing something on, we have this sensationally cool course, which is called Design Engineering, which is all about creating products and systems to kind of benefit humanity and society and taking the science and really applying it. And so I think there's so many ways that we as a university and I as a physicist try and make sure that people recognize that creativity is absolutely essential to what we do.
I mean, the one other thing that comes out of that for me is this idea that we have of always being good at things now, where, and I wonder how it affects young people, is, you know, to show success is, you know, across the world, but with social media, you're constantly being pushed to show that you are the best at something or you're being acknowledged for something. And so you might not be, you know, pursuing that particular path. Where as a cellist, you might be very good, you might be incredible, but you're not being able to check off that success in that particular field because you're focusing on physics at Imperial. And I do wonder if that's something that we've lost over time, is this ability to just have hobbies and to be very good and very creative in whatever way, but to be okay with just having had the hobby and have not that much to show for it. And I wonder if you see that with young people. And Olivia, it's also actually a question for you, is just kind of always being pushed to be good at things, and otherwise, what's the point of doing them?
I think it depends on the person. Like, I mean, if I think of friends and stuff, like so many people are doing 101 things and really happy for them to just be something they're doing. But the thing that I'm thinking about a lot is that in the UK, because we're speaking about sort of the education in the UK at a higher level, but if we look at what's happening to the much younger year groups in the curriculums, and there's this push for STEM subjects, but subjects like art, design, and music, which have been shown to help maths and science, are actually have been completely cut out of the education system. And Helena, who's not here at the moment, but her school is no longer offering art as a GCSE, and so it's beginning to look at that and go, hang on, if those subjects are only going to be properly available for students in private schools to study them and learn them and benefit from what they have. I just wonder what's going, because we often go to the arts industry and go like, you really need to back up that the arts have a place in the curriculum and for young people to have the chance to connect with those in their life. But I wonder if there's also room for sort of sciences also to kind of come on board with that conversation and go like, what are you doing for these young people and their futures?
I completely agree. I think that having art or music as a hobby that you do is something that is lost on this generation of young people, because they're striving so much to be the best. You need those 5 top level grades. You need that place at university. You need that thing. Universities don't really mind about all of the extra stuff you do on the side. You know, when I was at school, and maybe you too, Olivia, there was this kind of sense that you could do a few extracurricular things and that would be beneficial for your university application. But now the competition is so fierce and intense that it doesn't really matter what extracurricular things you've done. It really matters what grades you get. And if it only really matters what grades you get, then you completely push aside all the other things about you that make you you. And I actually completely agree that if we start hugely cutting access to music and the arts, it's going to become even more privileged and elitist than it is now. You know, we have a huge problem in the UK that we have this extraordinary arts industry, right? We have this extraordinary theatre, film and music industry, but it's still populated at very high levels by people who have very similar, you know, it's like our politicians, very, very similar privileged backgrounds. And if we start cutting access to that from a really young age, you'll just stop it higher up as well. You know, it will have a lasting impact on the UK artistic and scientific scene.
So I want to move on a little bit now to, your work in the scientific community. So you've obviously worked across the board. You've been helping young students, you've been helping young girls, you've been helping people from diverse backgrounds at that kind of, university and school age, but you've also been working to change the narrative in science. And we talked a little bit about your work with Wikipedia, and I'd love for you to talk more about that, but also more broadly, I'm really curious about this moment in time. We've talked a lot about pseudoscience, the idea of not just removing or ignoring women's profiles on Wikipedia, but also, science being fundamentally biased in many ways. I know, the same discussion can take place with technology and artificial intelligence. So I'm just really interested in your work there and how you are engaging with it right now during the pandemic and what's changed and what hasn't.
Oh, such a big question. There's like 10 loaded questions in there. So I started it because I started my physics degree, got towards the end of it and started a PhD and looked around me and realized just how white physics was and just how upper middle class, like very privately educated physics was and how male physics was. And so I kind of started working throughout my graduate studies and then my postdoc to try and improve the representation of women and people of color in physics, and did a bunch of activities with high schools, with teachers, with parents, kind of the most influential factors in young people's decisions. And then started thinking a lot more about how we build a better scientific community. It's one thing for people like you and I to go out and try and recruit more diverse people in science and technology, and you can do it, right? You can change the way that people think about a subject. And you can stand there and be super inspirational and get everyone really excited about physics or tech. But actually, unless the science and tech communities are ready to welcome and really honestly welcome with open arms these people into their, privileged spaces, then nothing will change because people will just leave. So I kind of started thinking a lot more about how we better honor and celebrate scientists from diverse backgrounds, because whilst they're small in number, they are there. There are women, there are distinguished women of color working in UK and US and all around the world, universities and industry and tech. And we're just not singing their songs enough. We're not talking about them enough. You don't learn about them in high school. You don't read about them in your magazines or newspapers because the media is not interviewing them. You rarely encounter them in a kind of meaningful way. And by that, I mean, there's a whole bunch of blogs and personal websites where you have kind of 50 best inspirational women in technology, but it's not breaking into the mainstream. It's not something yet that people are discussing in everyday conversation. And so actually, after I read Angela Saini's incredible book, Inferior, The True Power of Women and the Science That Shows It, which was really, it's a phenomenal, if you haven't read it, then you have to read it. It's a kind of non-fiction book that looks at the origin of bias against women in society and where it came from and just how bad the science was that was used to back up this bias. And it taught me so much about science itself, the fundamental process by which we do science, how bias can creep into almost everywhere, and particularly how we haven't honored or celebrated women throughout history. And then at the same time, a lot happened. It was 2017. I learned about Wikipedia and its huge, extraordinary influence on our lives, not just in a few of us checking out facts when we want to cheat in a quiz or a crossword, but also in influencing education, particularly in the global south, where you don't have access to textbooks at the same level that we do. How it influences science, actually, amazingly, and potentially this is true for the arts too. Interdisciplinary science benefits so much from having Wikipedia pages, because when you're starting a new scientific topic in something you don't know, you go to the Wikipedia page first, which is, there's been scientific studies on it. Actually, there was a great one I read the other day that said cities in Europe that have a photograph and a couple of paragraphs of text on their Wikipedia page have higher tourist revenues than cities that don't have that on their Wikipedia page. So it's all of these different sneaky aspects of our lives. And yet it's incredibly biased because Wikipedia is predominantly written by men, predominantly written by white men in North America. And so the content on there reflects what they think is important. And for too long, that hasn't included women or people of color. So I've been kind of on this campaign to make sure that the work of women scientists, and particularly women of color, but also broadly underrepresented groups in science are better represented on Wikipedia, so that the next time people click on to read about climate change or coronavirus or anything like that, they might land on one of these pages. And yeah, it's been over 2 years now, so I'm well into this project. So I've written over 1,150 pages. So it's been quite the journey.
And so just a little bit about that then. So firstly, like, how are you crowdsourcing this? Like, how do you get these like names? You know, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names I assume that you didn't know about, you know, before you started writing about them. And also, apart from the effort of doing it, I know it's not always been easy. And I wonder how that's felt at this time of sort of, you're doing it every day and everybody's locked down. And I know you get resistance from the most random quarters. And I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that, because I think it's really important for people to hear. There's this incredible story of success and this kind of unintentional bias of, you know, Wikipedia was filled in by a bunch of, you know, white men, but equally, the resistance to it, some of the work that you've done, I think, is something that's less known and far more surprising.
Yeah, so on the kind of first easy answer of getting names, there are so many. Like, I just look at who's recently won awards or who's giving a seminar where, or I go through university profiles, or throughout coronavirus, I've been looking at all of the experts who are working on, you know, the new vaccine or the new drug discovery or whatever. And I research and watch their videos and read their early work and, you know, put together this biography. So I'm never at a shortage for names. Sometimes I sit down and I'm like, who am I going to write about tonight? And it takes me 3 or 4 minutes to find someone sensational. So really, there are so many people internationally who are doing fantastic things that we're overlooking. And that kind of enthusiasm and excitement and the absolutely extraordinary research that these people do is what keeps you going, even when people respond badly to it. So it's what kind of keeps you inspired, keeps you exciting, keeps you asking all of these different questions. So when I started writing these Wikipedia pages at the beginning of 2018, there was kind of not huge, but pushback from the Wikipedia community, because they don't like to be called out for doing anything wrong. They like to have kind of control. There's for everyone who's watching or listening who doesn't know, Wikipedia, the content on it is entirely created by volunteers. Every single thing, every single word you read on Wikipedia should be written by a volunteer. There are some who are kind of privileged and administrators and have been there since the early days of the project in the early 2000s. And some of them are really motivated and like us and fighting for change. But some of them are quite happy with the way that things have always been. And they like all of the, you know, thousands of pages about battleships. And they like all of the weird pages about, you know, obscure telephone boxes. And they're not super happy or excited about having pages that have women in or people of color in. And so when I started writing, I was very criticized for putting people on that they said weren't notable. You know, it's an encyclopedia, and encyclopedias should contain content about things and people that are notable. And unfortunately, like history books, the notability criteria on Wikipedia are basically set up to select for privileged white men in the West. So it's, you know, if you're an academic, it's how many papers have you published, how many grants have you won, how many prizes have you won, how many times have those papers been cited, which have all been shown to be biased towards white Western men. So at the start, it was kind of pushing back against that and really trying to convince Wikipedia editors that it was serious and an important thing to do, that we had to document this history, that we have this opportunity now. You know, history books, when you look at them, when you look at science textbooks and history books, when you look at any history book, actually, they've pretty much all been written by white men for white men about other white men who've done things in the past. And Wikipedia is our chance and our platform to kind of correct that story and to tell it in a way, in a non-partisan way. You know, everyone reads Wikipedia. It's not political. It's completely neutral. It's incredibly localized to where you are geographically. We've got this opportunity now to tell these stories differently. And I think at the beginning, it kind of upset Wikipedia editors that I was doing that. And also that I was calling them out on national platforms. You know, when I started editing, maybe when I got up to my kind of 300th page or something like that, someone from one of the UK's national newspapers came to interview me. And I think that me talking about this bias in Wikipedia editing community angered a lot of them about me doing that. And, you know, a few trolls on social media and various things like that you get for doing anything that is right or just in the world. But actually it's made me a lot more proactive, not only in doing this Wikipedia project, but also working outside to make sure that I nominate more women of color for scientific prizes and awards, that I write about them when I have an opportunity to speak about them in newspapers or in the media, that we get those stories told, so that then I can use that as a citation to prove that they're notable on Wikipedia. So you know, if I don't have all of the references there, I'm going to go out and make the references happen. And potentially that frustrates and annoys them even more. But I've just tried to learn to ignore trolls, unless, I mean, I don't know how you handle it, Suhaira, or if you've ever had any.
So what I was going to say is two things. Is one thing that I've noticed is that you have, in the virtual space, you have this amazing, I wouldn't use the word army. You have this massive group of supporters who is on your side, and all of them are incredible scientists and journalists and writers. And, you know, I follow along, but I know that, you know, for every troll, you have all of these people who have been called to action by you and by your work. And it is hard work, and you're doing it every day. And I love that it's being recognized and acknowledged, but I also love that you've built this community across the scientific space. And it's not just, of course, the UK or Europe, it's definitely global. And it's helped you to have a voice that you possibly didn't realize that you have had. So I think on the one hand, obviously, you've become way more resilient in dealing with the negativity, but also, you know, you're not only standing up to these like crazy Wikipedia trolls, but also I'm sure in the scientific community, you're raising questions that are maybe uncomfortable. You know, we had this a few years ago when we did the art selfie on our Google Arts and Culture app, where you take a photo of yourself and it matches your face to the next best fit. That's a portrait. And most portraits are obviously of old white men, middle-aged and up. And obviously, like, you know, I used to either get Allegory of Winter or like, you know, all whatever, like it wasn't great. And so it just really motivated us to say, let's get portraits of people who are not this category of person onto our platform and see how we can expand it. And, you know, we're like this organization, this team, we had all this reach and resources, and here you are on your own, rewriting the narrative and, to your point, changing the script. So for me, it's super inspiring. And, you know, I think a lot about this with technology, is bias in technology. Obviously, gender bias in terms of who works at technology companies, who studies coding, computer science, but equally the end product that we're left with is, you know, intelligence that's defined also by a very narrow group of very privileged individuals, and we don't yet know how that impacts us in terms of our actions, our behaviors, or how we engage with technology. We won't probably know for a long time, and I wonder how much you're thinking about that space. You know, how does it impact healthcare down the line? How does it impact, you know, quantum computing? I don't know, like there must be so many ways that bias in science is manifested into the future. And I'm curious about if you're thinking about that at all.
Yeah, I think about all of those different things that you just said, probably not as eloquently or sophisticatedly as you do, but I do worry and I get stressed about them. I think the beautiful thing about Wikipedia pages is how quickly it's indexed by search engines. So if I write a Wikipedia page tonight, it will be near the top of a Google search tomorrow. And particularly if those pages have images on, it will go to the top of a Google image search, because the images are all open access and kind of have the right licenses to be shared. And so particularly when you're thinking about any tech that learns from that kind of data set, making sure we have more diverse people in those narratives is actually really crucial. So if you Google something like famous physicist or famous engineer, it will come up with the Wikipedia pages along the top that have the most clicks and the kind of biggest volume of content on their pages. So what's really phenomenal is to be able to change that, right? So to put more Black engineers and you know, physicists from South Africa on there, to make sure that we better tell the story of who's doing what. And I think that's starting to happen. You know, if you ask a question to one of your home assistants, so Amazon Alexa or Siri or whatever, the place that they go to for information is Wikipedia. So we really need to make sure that we have a really neutral and open data set there. But I think a lot of what you just mentioned about this bias creeping in is already there and already manifested, right? We don't need to wait. We just had the launch of the coronavirus tracking app in the UK. I don't know if you saw it. It was kind of another one of the government's massive successes. And in it, not only are you not able to input your own coronavirus test if you've had it in an NHS hospital, which makes no sense, but also they designed an app that can only work on quite sophisticated smartphones. So they've designed something and released something that already eliminates part of society who don't have them. Like, there are lots of members of my family around the country who can't install or download the app, some of whom are living in very high risk coronavirus areas, right? So we've already had a team of tech people who were well-intentioned in the beginning, but actually designed something that from a very basic fundamental level can't support everyone in society and is protecting the elites. Beyond that, we're already seeing the impact of bias in healthcare. I mean, you see it so much in North America when you look at the impact or the health outcomes of particularly Black women compared to pretty much any other demographic. When you look at the maternal health outcomes of Black women compared to any demographic, there was a paper that came out a couple of months ago that showed that Black women who go to see a Black doctor when they're having a baby are much more likely to have better outcomes. Their health outcomes are better. And that shouldn't be true, right? We're already seeing the impact of kind of racism and discrimination in healthcare. But it also happens in a more sophisticated and nuanced way in drug design and health testing and anything like that. So I don't think we're months, years away from this. I think this is already very much happening. And it's why this conversation about bias in our data sets, bias in experimental design, and bias in interpretation and analysis has to come in. You know, I could talk about this for a long time, but when coronavirus came to London, sounds like it's some little adventurer and he's just coming to visit. But when coronavirus first landed in London in kind of February, March, it was disproportionately impacting Black and minority ethnic communities, right? So we had white communities who were getting less severe forms of the disease than Black and minority ethnic communities. And everyone said, oh, it must be genetic, it must be biological, it must be because of all of these differences, of which there are none, right? The differences are absolutely minute and that could in no way cause this. And you had some very sensible scientists saying, no, this couldn't be it, this couldn't be it. But everyone wanted that to be the narrative. And then suddenly coronavirus kind of crept up to the north of the country, which is a lot more white than central London. And there you really saw that it was impacting people who were less affluent. It was very much a socioeconomic class. It was people who couldn't socially distance. It was people who couldn't not go to work and work from home. It was, you know, all of the things that we now know about it. And that conversation about Black and minority ethnic people being genetically more likely to get it or suffer from it disappeared very quickly. So we have a society, I think, who not only trust these kind of biased algorithms and data sets, but also want to believe that there's something different between different demographics. People really want to believe, they really wanted to believe at the beginning of coronavirus that this was genetic, that this wasn't because of their own bias. But actually it is because of our own, you know, it's because of the way society is structured and our own bias that this happens.
Go for it, Olivia.
So what have you been working on as you've kind of been talking about this? Have you been, I don't know, I'm just like trying to process everything, but I don't know, because we're talking about the stories that are being built right now, that are being created with technology today. And I think probably because it's been so unacknowledged historically, that it seems to, as you said, crept in, but actually it's been there all along, but has possibly not been made visible. So obviously the work you're doing in a huge way is making those biases and those stories more visible and the barriers that are there for them to actually be able to come to light. But what are you working on right now in relation to what you were just talking about?
Nice question. So
and your work in addressing pseudoscience.
So what is pseudoscience as a word? That's kind of, so like, is that because it sounds pseudoscience? Maybe it's because I've dyslexic brain, I don't necessarily process big words that well. But pseudoscience, is that like science that is mystical or false or not true?
Fantastic. Mystical sounds great, but really it's more that it is science under the guise of something that looks scientific but is false or just loaded with bias. Or, you know, you do something and you can set up something that looks like a scientific experiment, but actually you're really just measuring something because you want to prove whatever it is that your previous bias, you want to confirm it. And there's a whole bunch of misinformation and pseudoscience around the internet and around the world at the moment, which is basically confirming the biases of the people who are creating it or reading it. And unfortunately, this is perpetuating a whole lot of myths and distruths. So one of them was the Black and minority ethnic people suffering from coronavirus disease, right? You had all of this pseudoscience going around, and that made good people believe that this was the truth. You have it with flat earthers, you have it with anti-maskers, you have it with all of the, you know, climate change in a huge way. All of these different huge global issues are because a bunch of, what was that?
Vaccines.
Vaccines, huge one with vaccines. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out with coronavirus. But all of these huge issues are being propagated by pseudoscientists, by people who are doing fraudulent and dodgy research and experiments just to prove their own beliefs. And actually, Angela Saini, the author of this incredible book, Inferior, and subsequent book, Superior, The Return of Race Science, has been really campaigning to try and eliminate pseudoscience, or at least have a much more public conversation about how prevalent it is in our society. And she put together a team of people, of which Suhail was one, and a bunch of different academics, researchers, publishers, you know, journal publishers, people who work in tech and in the media, to try and tackle the ways that pseudoscience presents itself, to look at them, to understand the origins of it and the impact of it, and then to try and end the kind of way that it's spread around the, you know, the entire world, the UK, the US, but actually much, much more broadly. Something I think is incredibly crucial for all of this is kind of increasing education and public trust in science, and having much more open dialogues about how scientists work. You know, actually something fascinating about the pandemic is that the public have really seen for the first time how science happens. We didn't understand anything about this in December or January. We knew what coronaviruses were, but people didn't understand anything. And the public have been there the entire way through, as we really didn't understand masks. At the beginning, everyone was saying, do we need to wear a mask? We're not sure about this. We don't know anything about this virus. To now saying, actually, masks are super important. And remember, washing your hands was right. But they're seeing this whole story, you know, ventilators were the huge thing in March. And now hospitals really don't want to use ventilators because you actually want your patients to survive whatever treatment that you're giving. And so we've seen this kind of public science interaction in a way that we never have done before. And I think it's been really interesting, actually, particularly coming back to tech, to see how social media companies have responded to this. You know, Twitter had a really big campaign in March, April, to make sure that all of the epidemiologists giving out proper public health advice were verified on Twitter. So you had all of these epidemiologists and public health doctors who before weren't verified, but now have that nice little blue tick next to their name that gives them some kind of public credibility. And I think you now see that interaction happening completely differently. But something I think we really need to do, and something that I've been kind of working on, or at least trying to begin to work on, is thinking about how we introduce these discussions about pseudoscience and misinformation, and how to properly interpret science or articles or newspaper articles into education. So how do we have that conversation with high school students? How do they then have that conversation with their parents? How do we have that conversation with undergraduate students? That what you read isn't always completely a wall of facts, that actually what you read might contain some significant amounts of misinformation. You're going to have to learn how to interpret that.
So for me, this is even more powerful given, you know, when we speak of a pandemic, everybody's experiencing it and everyone has access to similar kinds of information. And how do you counter that? So being in Pakistan these last few months, everything is on WhatsApp, and just obviously this range, a vast range of all kinds of conspiracy theories from day one, like hyper sophisticated content, is how, you know, the way you've used this global platform, Wikipedia, how we need to think about leveraging. How do you have teachers around the world, or parents or kids around the world, feel empowered to say, this is truth and this isn't, and this is how I decide, who I can trust and who I can't. So I think that increasingly it becomes more powerful. I did have one final question, and then we want to ask you about the futures. In terms of the scientific community, I know you found your people, and I'm really curious about that. We've been talking a lot about community and how this moment of the pandemic, we talk about words like cluster, community. You find people near you, physically close to you, but you've built that around the world, and you've been able to expand that over time. I mean, I know you started from a place of, this was you and your belief, and you were building out your vision as a scientist, as a physicist, and also as an activist. How has that journey been? Has that surprised you? And, you have all these friends and connections around the world. How do you leverage one another to have greater impact? And do you foresee passing on some of your Wikipedia work to others? Has that come up at all?
Yeah, for sure. It's such a good question. I mean, as a scientist, and as all of you, you collaborate with people all around the world all the time. And it's actually been like my biggest privilege as a scientist to interact with so many people from so many different backgrounds in so many different countries. And it kind of comes back to the very nature of this network and this platform that you're building, that the interdisciplinarity of it has been the most important thing for me. And, I love that idea to connect and learn from people. And it probably also comes back to having a kind of primary training in the arts, and now working with chemists and material scientists, that I really don't care if I look like an idiot. I'm just going to ask the question. I'm just going to say, please explain this to me in the most basic way that you physically can. And that has benefited me so much as a scientist. I think growing and building this network of like-minded people who want to change science, who want to have some positive impact on society, has been completely fundamental to me having any kind of more senior scientific career. There's no way that I'd be going for a fellowship or going for a next job if I hadn't found this community of people to support and kind of, to bounce ideas off, to say, is this completely, am I completely losing it? Or is this a really good idea? Or is this something that we should push? Is this something that we create? And having that network of people who think this is the right thing to do has been so, so crucial for me. I think it started though, when I was a postgrad student or a postdoc, and you just start to realize how, I've never worked in a research group where there's been other women at my level. I work in a team now of all men, led by 2 men. And I'm not saying they're not all incredible and great and supportive, but you do look around and you think there's no one else really here that that looks or is like me. And I know this is much more extreme and intense if you're a Black scientist and you come into an entirely white physics department, but you do get that sense that potentially you're not good enough to be there and you don't really belong. And so I started connecting with people on social media primarily, who were other women scientists all over the world, also in these situations and these environments. And actually Wikipedia as a platform, talking about Wikipedia, training people in how to edit Wikipedia has been something I've done, in high schools in Brazil, in cool clubs in New York, in presidential palaces somewhere in Spain. So actually Wikipedia has been this opportunity to grow this network even further, to take it even, out of English into other languages, and to really, really think about how we as a scientific community come together internationally to better celebrate these people that we're really overlooking. And it's been amazing. I don't know if you've been following Suhair, but over the past few months on Twitter, all of the kind of early career researcher Black scientists have just been telling their stories. So after that awful incident with the black birder in New York and the kind of fallout that followed, a group of Black naturalists came together. And naturalist to me as a Brit sounds very naughty and like people who are naked on a beach, but actually it means people, Black researchers who work in environmental sciences, came together and told the stories of Black birders. And then we had kind of Black neuroscientists, and then we had Black chemists, and then we had Black engineers. And actually, I think these networks of people, kind of early career researchers, people who are really determined to change the world that they're going into. You see academia, you see tech, you see engineering, you see the arts, you see this huge disparity between what people can and can't achieve based on the color of their skin or their gender or their socioeconomic class, and you just say we're not going to put up with that anymore, like we're not going to do it. And I think that it's like a magnet, right? Everyone just gets so enthusiastic and everyone supports each other and amplifies each other. So yeah, I mean, I love it. I love this kind of science community. I love that I can wake up in the middle of the night and send a message to my friend in DC and be like, did you check this thing out? And then you get some scientific answer back at 3 a.m. I love waking up to an email being like, super cool science results, because someone has been working on it overnight. So yeah, I think it's been, you know, it's extraordinary. It's really extraordinary.
I love that. And I have to say that one thing that I've really felt the last few months has been engaging outside of this. You know, you talked about people of your level, so you have that, then you have your role models, and I've been spending a lot more time with students, and obviously, Jess, you do that with your work. And we talk about silos. We're so siloed also in terms of, like, you know, people who have a job should be at, you know, with other people who have a job, and people who are studying or of a certain age should be in that box. And that's taken away so much from all of us. And I do think having access to, you know, obviously the most famous one of them all, Greta Thunberg or Malala, just their voices has added so much to our world the last few years because of social media. And so I really hope that we can push ourselves to cross those boundaries a lot more too, because for me, it's really been personally enriching. But we have to end now because we're extremely over everyone's time, and Jess, you're super busy. So, and Olivia also. So Olivia, would you like to ask Jess the final question?
Yes. So something we've been asking all our speakers is if they have a manifesto or vision for the future. I don't know if you've had a chance to think about that in advance, but it's really about your dreams for the future in some way, in terms of what you would like to do if you didn't have to think about resources or money or time, in terms of something, if you could dream it, that's what you would do.
I think I'd completely transform the way we teach young people. I think that particularly kind of primary school and high school education is so important for every different aspect of our personalities, of our confidence, of our career aspirations, of ultimately where we'll be and end up and contribute to society. And I think that when you look at education worldwide, it's incredibly segregated into the haves and the have-nots. And it's very gendered and it's very racialized. And what I would like to do, what I would do as my manifesto, is make sure that we better support and train teachers. Unfortunately, it does include money, because I think we need to better pay teachers so that they feel valued, but also make sure that teachers and good teachers are evenly distributed across the world. You know, I want to make sure that everyone has, if they want to study art, they can go and study art because they had that inspirational art teacher. That art teacher will recognize the importance of their scientific and mathematical education in their artistic practice. I want everyone to realize that physics is this really cool and incredibly dynamic and evolving discipline that we really don't understand everything about yet. We just don't get it. And we need more people from diverse backgrounds to help us work that out. And yeah, I honestly believe if we had people like you guys planning education or thinking about education, we'd have a much, much more diverse generation of future leaders. And yeah, so my manifesto is I want to completely, is that big enough? I want to completely overhaul kind of young people's education in arts and sciences.
Oh my God, we were meant to say at the end, we'd like to help you to achieve this goal. So
I think that sounds amazing.
We'd love to think with you, sort of taking this forward as to like how to begin a new kind of conversation, and not enough, you know, one is never going to be enough. So thank you for sharing that, Jess. I think it not only is it amazing, it adds so much richness to what we've been thinking about already these last few sessions. So I'm going to end there, and thank you so much for joining us from London. And we are going to be going over this again, coming back to you with further questions and further thoughts and sharing with our community. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.